One thing you will not find on my resume is I spent 6 years involved in commercial fishing with this boat. I was a young man then, and it was not such a great idea, but it was interesting. But the cool thing is, this was my boat, and this is a boat I saw in the harbor here yesterday, and you can tell that these have clear, similar genetic material. They're, you know, very similar. And both very pretty, I think. Anyway, I'm not sure what the take-home message is there. I guess it's, if you're going to do foolish things, do it when you're young. Ah, yes. What I'm really going to talk about is registration. So this is some exploratory work I did with some postdocs a few years ago at the hospital. I work at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I went there as a postdoc right after I got my PhD, figuring I'd take it easy for a year, finish some papers and so on, find a real job, and I never found a real job. So first I'll talk about the context of the work and some motivation for it, and then tell the story about this Bayes investigation of non-rigid registration with some applications in neurosurgery and head and neck radiotherapy. So the context of this thing is a fairly big NIH grant we have called National Center for Image-Guided Therapy. And the PI was Frank Yolez. He actually died a little bit ago, or a year ago, unfortunately. But anyway, within that, I developed a collaboration with a radiation physicist named James Balter at the University of Michigan. And that led to a collaboration. This grant we have is focused on an interventional suite we have that's called Amigo. It's a little hard to read here, but Amigo is a 3-bay room. So this is the central room. It has an operating table. It has rotational angiography. It has ultrasound. This is sort of a garage door. Behind this door is a 3 Tesla Siemens magnet that can move out over the table. And then over here, there's a GE PET-CT we've started using for interventional guidance. More pretty pictures. Anyway, this is called Amigo. It's been open for a few years now, and we're very excited about it. It's essentially the focus of the research community that I'm in. So anyway, registration has been around for a long time, including non-rigid registration, but the community is really starting to open up to the idea, like radiation oncology, radiation treatment. There's now quite a bit of enthusiasm about using registration to help sort things out, as Ben was talking about earlier today. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So one point I want to make is that rigid registration is used commercially a fair amount, like in the BrainLab navigation system, and there's established quality control for rigid registration, and they use that to ensure that their transforms are adequately good for the application at hand. I mean, some of these things are FDA approved, I think that sort of thing is much less developed for non-rigid registration. Non-rigid registration can be a pretty hard problem. So here's an example of pre-op to intra-op MR, where there's a tumor pre-op and there's a resection here. There's, you know, a piece missing essentially, and we want to register these things. Things do move around and disappear. And it is on some level an ill-defined problem, because ideally we want a dense vector field that makes the map from one image to the other. So there's really, you know, as many equations, or there's as many things we're trying to solve for as there is data, almost, or really. So that's tricky. There's noise. And then in images, there's often homogeneous areas. Like in conventional MR, there's parts of the white matter. It's hard to see here, but the parts of the white matter that are really pretty homogeneous looking. So you don't really have anything to get traction for registration. So to counteract that, there's a tendency to use regularizers to bring additional information. But really, Regularizer is just kind of a fancy name for guessing, is one way to put it. So it's useful. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I think we should be aware of what we're doing. And often we do modeling that's not quite perfect either. So the problem I'm having is people are wanting to apply non-rigid registration in interventional settings to figure out where to, like, you know, put stuff. And it makes me nervous because I've seen non-rigid registration codes go very badly astray. And so I think it would be good to try to figure out how to put error bars on the things that we tell surgeons. And from my point of view, or a very natural way to try to do that is by way of posterior distributions. It seems like the most natural thing, modulo philosophical disagreements with certain people in my department. But anyway, so the components in this kind of approach are a likelihood term that measures image agreement, some prior model on deformations, which is the regularizer. And then our goal in this project was to estimate posterior distributions on configurations. That's what this is mostly about. And then I'll talk about how to handle model parameters. That's on some level pretty conventional image-based registration, conventional likelihood terms. The prior we wound up using essentially takes a stiffness matrix from linear elasticity and just scales it. It essentially uses the stiffness matrix as the structure of the covariance, but scales it. And we are in the small deformation regime. The posterior, we're not putting any functional or any distributional assumption on the posterior. We're leaving that general and to be inferred by MCMC, Markov-Chain Monte-Carlo, which I'll talk briefly about. The attraction in exploratory work of Markov-Chain Monte-Carlo is you can, it's very free. You can essentially make whatever distributional assumptions you want to. So in that sense, it's easy to prototype things. And it can be slow, however, like in this example. Yeah, some people do real-time registration. We do like registration that takes all weekend, essentially. In registration, there are parameters you need to deal with. And so an approach that we're attracted to, and I'll talk about, is marginalizing over the parameters so that we don't have to try to get them from textbooks or otherwise tweak. And I'll summarize some results. So conventional image registration is often written and discussed in terms of energies. It's like there's an energy term that quantifies image agreement and another energy term that penalizes unreasonable deformations, and then you optimize over these energies. And typically, what you get is essentially a single answer, which might be this value of u, the one that minimizes the energy, is the answer. And so what we're trying to do is move somewhat away from that so that we get potentially not just an answer, but perhaps, you know, we could talk about multiple modes, and also, I think importantly, talk about how broad the modes are, give some information about how uncertain the answer is. So going back to my standard syntax of graphical model figures, essentially, I'm going to start with a simple version that has fixed parameters. So the main random variable is the deformation field u, and that operates to modify the moving image. And so the generative term for the moving image is conditioned on the fixed image, and the deformation field is it's essentially e to the negative sum squared error over a parameter. So it's another way to put it is it's a Gaussian distribution, IID Gaussian distribution around the prediction made by warping the fixed image, warping the moving image, hopefully into agreement with the fixed image. I'll talk more about these terms a little later. The deformation field, as I talked about earlier, is this elastic deformation energy with a scale parameter. That's at this point, both of these parameters, the the regularizer parameter and the image agreement term parameter are both known. And so the idea was we would use Markov-Chain Monte-Carlo to characterize the posterior on deformations against these models. The likelihood term in slightly more detail is sum squared error, which you could write as an integral if you want to. So it's fixed image minus the moving image. The moving image has been distorted, if you will, by the deformation field. And it is Gaussian about the prediction. The deformation prior, as I said earlier, is linear elastic deformation energy. So what we did is discretize the deformation field. And if you discretize linear elastic deformation energy, you get a quadratic energy, which is very convenient. So this energy is quadratic in the displacement field, and there's in mechanics, there's a stiffness matrix which characterizes the artificial mechanical system, if you will. And also, the stiffness matrix is banded, which is useful. There's a couple of ways to think about what this prior means. I think maybe the most sensible way to think about it is it's a large multivariate Gaussian or normal distribution where we just cooked up the covariance structure by borrowing the stiffness matrix and scaling it with a parameter. Another way to think about it is in terms of Boltzmann's distribution and a synthetic physical system, but it's pretty far removed from the reality of physics, I think. I think there's probably also a Gaussian process equivalence to this prior. We didn't work that out, but I think it probably is an instance of a Gaussian process model. Okay, so this is my one slide on MCMC. So the goal here is we want to characterize this posterior distribution on deformations, and the idea is to do it by random sampling, like using random number generators, essentially. And some distributions are easy to sample, like it's quite easy to sample Gaussians or multivariate Gaussians. But other distributions like this one, the one we care about, it's not obvious at all how we would directly sample this. So there's a really nice technique called Metropolis-Hastings MCMC, which provides a way to accomplish that. So the idea with that is that you sample from not the real distribution, but another one called the proposal distribution that you hope is at least somewhat similar to the real distribution. And then the magic of MCMC is that it has this rule whereby you accept or reject a sample from the proposal distribution according to this formula. It's probabilistically, and it requires the evaluation of the true distribution and the proposal distribution on the sample and the previous guy. And the magic or coolness is that asymptotically, the chain of samples you get from this process are asymptotically from the true distribution. So it's a way to sample from a distribution that you otherwise might probably not be able to sample from. And I think MCMC will be talked about in more detail later in this meeting. The proposal distribution we used is a big Gaussian, and we used a covariance structure that's actually an instance of a Gaussian process with exponential covariance. So the advantages of it are you can sample distributions that are otherwise hard to sample. Tricky aspects are somehow you have to decide when you've done enough sampling, and it can be slow. One point I guess I'd like to point out is that this formula that you need to evaluate for accepting and rejecting samples, what it requires is the evaluation of this ratio of probabilities. And the nice thing about that is pretty often the normalizers cancel, and that makes life easier. And that's true in the present case of fixed parameters. Those things do cancel. So there's standard technology for trying to figure out if you've converged. One of them is running parallel chains and doing statistics to see if they are getting to the same place more or less, or in other ways use sliding windows with statistics and see if the statistics have settled down. I guess I'd like to say that the book Bayesian that I mentioned previously, Bayesian Data Analysis by Gelman and others, is a nice reference on this technology. And there are standard packages. We didn't use them here, but there's one called Bugs that gets a lot of use. Okay, so we did initial experiments with fixed parameters, and it seemed like it was doing sensible things. We were encouraged. But we really wanted to get out of the parameter game. I mean, we were just kind of tweaking around with the parameters, saying, yeah, that works pretty good. That's sort of okay, whatever. And it's just kind of dissatisfying. Plus, there's this nagging concern that you should, whenever you try a new application, you should change them or whatever. So we tried to get out of the parameter business. And what we did was the Bayes style of marginalizing them out. So what's changed here is these two guys used to be known fixed parameters. What's happened is they've turned into random variables that have their own prior distributions on them, and we have fixed parameters. And there's a style where you try to engineer the thing so that the priors on parameters are made to be uninformative, sort of in the sense of uniform distributions, but it's a little more complicated than that. So in this stuff, we used log normal priors on the parameters. This is the noise parameter and the regularization parameter, or overall stiffness parameter. We used priors on those guys that are essentially uninformative. So the idea is that we just rely on the data to inform the inference about the parameters rather than us telling it what they are. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. And so the thought was to try to use MCMC to characterize this posterior, but it's gotten a little more complicated because of the marginalization of the parameters that's expressed here. And the real problem is that, in theory, we could just sample not just the deformation, but we could sample the parameters as well, sort of in the standard way with Markov-Chain Monte-Carlo. But the problem is that the probability model we're using has those parameters in its normalizer, and the normalizer of this model is extremely difficult to grapple with. So essentially that meant we had to do something else. And so Firdaus Janus, who was a postdoc, this work was the work of two postdocs, Firdaus Janus and Peter Rischholm. Firdaus came up with a style of using Laplace approximations. So it's kind of a nested optimization with MCMC and Laplace approximations to characterize the distribution on the parameters. And I don't want to go into any detail on that. It's funny, we called it fast marginalization of hyperparameters because it was vastly faster than the really unfeasible, straightforward MCMC. But in all fairness, the thing took quite a long time to run. It took a weekend or so to do a run of this system. So I'm returning to it. This is the exact same slide again. And the point I want to make here, I'll review it again. It's fixed image. Moving image is offset by the deformation field. There's a noise parameter for the image agreement term. There's a regularization parameter. And that's the model. Meanwhile, our colleagues at Oxford were having similar Bayesian thoughts. And so this is a model this came from the thesis research of Ivor Simpson. And this is, I think, maybe at least one of the papers from that effort, and I think there have been some since then. But anyway, the models are pretty similar. X and Y are the images. The image Y is being transformed according to a deformation field W, which has a regularizer that has a parameter that has uninformative priors on it. Similarly, the, what's this guy? That's the noise variance parameter. Also has an uninformative prior on it. So really, the models are extremely similar in spirit. It's really the same structure. The difference is, the major difference is that they approached it using variational bays to characterize the posterior. It's another approximation style, and I think in this context it's vastly faster than Markov-Chain Monte-Carlo. And it did get them a posterior, which is normal, but I don't think that's a problem, probably. It worked out well in their application. I'm pretty sure this is available in a software package from FIMRIB called FNIRT, F-N-I-R-T. I think it's in that, maybe. Or at least they were developing this for FNIRT, as I recall. Great work. Yeah, so anyway, so that's the technology, kind of a, I have to say a bit of a brute force attempt at characterizing in a fairly general way posterior distributions in non-rigid registration with marginalized parameters. So then, I told the surgeon about it, and she kind of went, "Yeah, what am I going to do with that?" And so we had to. So the nice thing about MCMC is the result in our case is this bucket of like 1 million deformations that characterize the posterior deformation, the distribution, on deformations. And so the nice thing is that from that set of samples, you can easily construct any derived statistics you want. So I'll give a few examples. Like perhaps the simplest one is you could characterize the average image under the so this average over the samples is the same as the average expected value of the image under the distribution asymptotically. So there's a lot of other summaries of information you might provide. So one I'll try to get at here is, let's say we're concerned about where this tooth moves to from this image to this image, and the registration system is giving us, essentially what this would be is if this is a single point, then this would be the marginal distribution on the location of that point. In this case, for some reason, it's only dispersed in X. So one way to characterize the spread here would be use the interquartile range. That's a pretty standard way of characterizing the spread in a distribution. It captures the distance between quartiles. Oops. Oh, yeah, there's another one. Oh yeah, so here we're characterizing the uncertainty in the location of the eye. So presumably the location of the eye is a little sharper in this example because of the image structure. One of the things about this, the two main pieces are, in probability terms, the prior on deformations. The other thing is the image likelihood term it's a likelihood function on deformations. And the thing is, it can be very complicated. It depends on, the details of the image structure, how things are structured in the physical space of the image establishes the structure of that likelihood function. So it's not going to be real simple in general. One caveat is that while we're predicting, let's say, marginal distributions on where things are, that doesn't mean that they're centered on where the right answer is. It's just where our estimator has, let's say, a mean and variance, but it might not really be in the right place. Or it might be more or less in the right place, but have really big variance. So in the end, when you use these things, you have to do model checking of some sort to ensure that your predictions actually do line up with reality to some extent. So the preliminary, let's see, how am I doing on time here? 6, good, perfect, okay. So the two applications I'll talk about are neurosurgery and head and neck radiotherapy. So what we wanted to do was explore how we would prepare visualizations that reflect the uncertainty in these registration results. So one of the things we did was, we tried various things. One is to show summaries of marginal variances. Like this, I think, is the variance in one direction, the marginal variance in one direction. And so it's a little satisfying in the sense that the registration system in the zone where the images can't really be made to agree because of the resection, it's saying that its prediction of the posterior variance is pretty big, which is nice, or plausible at least. Another one we did is this, the surgeon makes a lot of use of fMRI, so it's preoperative fMRI, so she wants to project the pre-op MRI into the intraoperative scenario, so we were thinking we would send these. The fMRI are essentially blobs. It's hard to see it, but there's a little blob here traced in a gray line, and the idea is to project that blob, sort of fMRI activation blob, into the intraoperative scene. And this is one way we thought about doing it. This is essentially under the distribution on deformations, this is the probability that you're inside the blob. So these colors kind of show that in this zone it's confidently inside the blob, but then it gets sort of unconfident around the boundaries of the thing. So I think this is a potentially understandable way to convey uncertainty. But I do have to admit that I think the visualization of uncertainty and this kind of thing, and also for that matter in science in general, I think is a really undeveloped area. And it's been frustrating because it's been difficult to convince the NIH that they should fund that kind of thing, because reviewers tend to think it's the stuff of high school students or something. But anyway. Here's an example where the surgeon also uses tractography to trace out important white matter structure. So what we did is essentially jitter the tractography by the uncertainty in the deformations, and so it makes it blurry, and the amount of blur is an attempt to convey how sharp the information is. This is hard to read, but it's a similar blurred construct. This one is using how frequently these sort of jittery jittery tractography results, how frequently they land in a voxel. So it's a voxel occurrence count, and it does show it conveys spread to some extent. I have to say this stuff is really preliminary, but I think someday we're going to have to, us or someone is going to have to do a good job at these things. Okay, now I'll switch gears to head and neck radiotherapy. Okay, all right, so this was actually, the guy that ran our program, Frank Gilles, was a really interesting character. He was kind of a crazy Hungarian who had been a neurosurgeon in early life, fled Hungary, came to the US, became a radiologist, and but kept us focused on, in our radiology department, he kept us focused on intervention and a lot of neurosurgery. Anyway, Frank, in his enthusiasm, identified James Balter, a radiation physicist at the University of Michigan, and put us together and said, "You will work together." So it's like, okay. So we did. So what Balter wanted to do was, this guy he was a riot, frankly. I really miss him. Anyway, so at the University of Michigan, they were doing radiation treatment in the neck with a relatively standard rotating linear accelerator treatment machine, but they also had an X-ray camera on the thing, which I guess is getting to be pretty common. So they were also collecting, at each treatment, they were collecting cone beam CT. And so their idea was, what they wanted to do was, they had the planning CT where they studied the patient and made the dose plans. They wanted to register the planning CTs to the current configuration of the patient at each treatment by way of this cone beam CT. And then through that process, make better estimates of the delivered dose by essentially measuring where the patient is in the treatment machine. Usually they just kind of, you know, try to fix them in place with wedges and stuff and try and be in the same place. But it's a challenge because these patients are maybe losing weight. Hopefully the tumor is shrinking over the course of their treatment. So it's a little bit unreasonable to assume that the patient stays the same and stays in the same position at each treatment. So there's 35 treatments typically. So they said, yeah, help us do this registration. And I'm going, let's see, you want to do non-rigid registration of CT and cone beam CT, and you're concerned about soft tissues. I'm kind of going, boy, there's not much contrast for those soft tissues, as you'll see, perhaps. And so this seemed like a great place to deploy the uncertainty stuff, so we tried that. So this is the model we came to. So what's changed here, it's the same model that we were using before. I flipped it on its side, but it's the same fixed moving, except now there's there's a plate that's replicating over the 35 treatments now. So there's 35 moving images and 35 deformation fields. So otherwise, this part of the modeling is the same as it was before for the 2-image case, but now this bit here, this part of the old model has been replicated over each treatment, and then in addition, we're predicting dose. So what happens is we use the deformation field to warp the dose plan into the current configuration of the patient, and then accumulate the dose over all this is the plan, the treatment plan. Actually, that should be outside the box. Oh my goodness, another bug. Okay, so the treatment plan gets warped by the deformation field to calculate the dose of the current treatment, and that gets accumulated for what matters is the total accumulated dose over all of the treatments. So the way the dose goes is we can induce a distribution on dose at a specific, and I have to apologize, the notation is slightly different in this slide, but anyway, we can get a distribution on the dose at a particular treatment by essentially just leveraging by using our distribution on, this is an expected dose, by averaging the warped dose over the distribution on deformations. So we make an average dose for each treatment, and then we need to accumulate the complete dose. If the dose at each treatment is characterized by a separate random variable, then when we combine them all, assuming conditional independence, dose is additive. We need to convolve the dose distributions to get the total dose distribution. So we did that. One of the things I actually really liked about working in radiation therapy is they are quantitative a lot more than neurosurgery is. That was kind of cool. Okay, so this is really kind of hard to read, but let's see now. The parotid gland is here. So this is, I think this is, this is CT. Frankly, the contrast for the parotid gland is really, really subtle in CT. And so they use their anatomical knowledge to do they routinely hand trace all the structures that matter when they're doing the treatment plan. And then they run this giant optimizer to make a good treatment. This is showing some of the uncertainty in the registration. So this is a registration of the planning CT to a cone beam CT. This thing is showing essentially an indication of the posterior on where the parotid gland is. And well, you can see it's fairly fuzzy. The expert, it's hard to see it, but I'm tracing what the expert did. This sort of green thing is the expert's idea of the true location of the parotid gland. here. So I think it's like the true location of the parotid seems reasonably consistent with our prediction. I think maybe our prediction is a tiny bit optimistic. Maybe it should have been a little broader, perhaps. Or maybe we needed a better registration algorithm. Anyway, quite a bit of uncertainty in where that parotid gland is. So what we did was push through the effects of the uncertainty about where things were at each treatment and accumulate that into dose statistics. So there's a tool that radiation physicists use all the time for characterizing dose it's called a dose volume histogram. And so what it is, it's kind of a cumulative distribution on dose. So for example, so this is a cumulative dose volume histogram for a collection of structures, like PTV is the thing they want to treat. So you can see this guy, let's see, it's like, I don't know, it's like virtually all of the voxels in the planned treatment volume are getting more than 60 gray of radiation. So this is saying we're really cooking that tumor. But then the structures that they care about, like let's say, I don't know, normal brain, they would hope that the histograms would be kind of more over to the left so that the structures at risk are getting less radiation. That's what they want. So that's the kind of thing they have to optimize, is try to get dose into the tumor but not like damage other things. So this one shows, it shows banded, so what we did is use the distribution. We have distributions on everything, essentially. We use those distributions to predict dose volume histograms that have spread in them. The spread is due to the uncertainty in all the estimates. And so this shows the dose volume histograms for the submandibular gland at 7 selected treatments. So you can see that as the treatments march on, the dose is getting higher. This is higher dose. This shows for one particular voxel in the submandibular gland, it shows the distribution on dose for that voxel. So there's a fair amount of spread or uncertainty on what the delivered dose is due to the sloppiness in all of this registration, I would say. This is the dose volume histograms that summarize the total treatment. And so what we see here is these colored things are banded estimates of the dose volume histogram. The dotted line is the plan. That's what they thought they were going to achieve if they perfectly implemented their treatment. And so I guess a nice thing is that it seems as if the parotid gland got less radiation. Looks like the submandibular gland got somewhat more radiation than they thought it would. Like the planned radiation to the submandibular gland is outside of on the low side of the 50% quantile of our estimate of what was actually delivered. Let's see. One of the things I really grew to like about radiation therapy is that they actually have quantitative treatment metrics. And one reason they have these is they have to solve a pretty complicated optimization problem to design their dose. So they start with tracing of where all the organs are, and essentially what they say is they have a way, given the dose distribution, they have formulas for calculating tumor control probability. So what they want to do is adjust the dose plan so that the tumor control probability is high. And then they also have ways of calculating normal tissue complication probability for the organs at risk, like, for example, the parotid gland. That's the kind of thing where if you over-irradiate the parotid gland, I think you stop making saliva, which is a really unpleasant problem to have. So they want to have high probability controlling the tumor and low probability of damaging the structure. So they have ways of calculating those things, and they calculate those things inside the inner loop of how they optimize the plan for the patient. It's pretty highly developed technology. So we, in a preliminary way, we pushed our distributions on everything in sight and calculated the impact on normal tissue complication probability for the parotid. And so what we found is that the mean is somewhere around 55% probability of complication, but there's some moderate probability of 70% chance of complication. So in summary, we did a Bayesian exploration of non-rigid registration in a fairly general form, and tried it out in applications in neurosurgery and head and neck radiotherapy. And I think for me, it's kind of a beginning. I would like to, in the radiation therapy domain, I would really like to keep going, because I think the field is now ready to embrace uncertainty quantification. It's become a buzzword in radiation. And for me, probability theory seems like the most natural way to model those things, although there are a fair number of conservative physicists in that field who can be uncomfortable with that, but then they don't have a lot of better suggestions. Other directions I'd like to go is intersubject registration. And we have been beginning to push on Gaussian process models. We did see evidence of non-Gaussianity in some of our posterior marginal distributions on things. So sometimes I think if the image structure is kind of complicated or repetitive, you can wind up with multiple modes. But I think my intuition is that Gaussian process is a reasonable compromise, at least for the interim, until we can come up with something less restrictive. So we have started going in that direction, as have other people. In INRIA, there's some nice work there. So in rigid registration, there is a pretty established methodology for evaluating how good the registration is working in a navigation system. There's these concepts of fiducial localization error, fiducial registration error, target registration error. All these things are quantified, and they have ways of estimating them on the fly while you're using the system, essentially, which is great. Things are a lot less developed in non-rigid registration. There's been some, in 2004, some work on finding Kramer-Rao bounds of the estimators. There's been some other work in Gaussian approximation of energy landscapes at minima, bootstrap methods, or, well, of course, the variational Bayes work at Oxford. Also, actually, later, Ivor Simpson did move towards using Gaussian process priors after his thesis, which I think make a lot of sense. Actually, this stuff, it's like everything old is new again, or vice versa. A lot of these ideas were around a while ago. Jim G., I think when he was a graduate student working for Regina Baici, worked on fairly similar things. Of course, the computers were so slow that they can only do 2D toy problems at the time, but they had a lot of the similar stuff, like priors using Gibbs distributions and elastic stuff. They had population-based priors. They had clever sampling approaches for sampling the posterior. They did some 2D intersubject MR, some atlas-based. So I think this is another one of those examples where the models often have existed for a long time. Some of the models we use are ancient, and what changes a lot is how we solve them. Like new technologies, like discrete solvers become available, and they do change the landscape. But it's sort of like some of the stuff really lasts for a long time. This was the work of Peter Rischholm, actually while he was a PhD student and then later as a postdoc, and Firdaus Janus, who worked on a PhD at our, well, he was a student at Ohio, but worked on a problem at our place, and then he was a postdoc at our place. Here's a summary of papers. I'm sure you can't read this, but when they hand out the slides, you'll be able to see this is all the stuff we did related to that. And this was really made possible by the National Center for Image-Guided Therapy. The PI is now Claire Tempany. Thank you.